Hey everyone, thank you for joining. Give me a sec. All right. Hey everyone, thank you for joining. My name is Saurabh, and we are talking about the EU privacy laws, Salesforce, and AI. I'll start with a disclaimer. This is not legal advice. This is not Salesforce's point of view. This is our point of view, and everything that's provided here and elsewhere you hear is for informational purposes. We are not a law firm. We are just talking about this based on our perspective and our experiences with a large number of customers from all across the world. So, with that, let's move on. The agenda for today is that we are going to talk about Salesforce and AI and its business implication. We'll take a look at some of the GDPR compliance that companies are doing today or need to do today. We'll also look at the AI Act from EU. We'll talk about the related risks, ethics, and a whole lot of those kind of things. And we will also talk about other considerations for policy and processes for Salesforce and AI. And we'll follow that up with question and answers. So, with that out of the way, my name is Saurabh Gupta. I'm the CEO and co founder of Cloud Compliance and GPT-Fi. We are a Salesforce App Exchange ISV partner. And my focus area is data security, data privacy, AI, all in the context of Salesforce. We have an app on the App Exchange called GPT-5, which lets you securely bring in AI capabilities like ChatGPT to your enterprise through Salesforce. This is done 100% natively on Salesforce and follows a bring your own model, so you can integrate it with any of the AI models or LLMs of your choice. With that out of the way, I'll turn it over to Puneet. Puneet, please go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Saurabh, and hello everyone. My name is Punit Bhatia. I am the founder and CEO of company Fit for Privacy, and we help companies with AI and privacy advice. So that means your strategy, governance, risk management questions on privacy or AI, we help you with. And in context of GDPR, CCP, or any other law, you are at the right place. And how do we do it in early days is, I think if you can go to the next slide, there's a lot of questions around AI, there's a lot of confusion around AI, and also on sometimes privacy. So we do workshops on AI privacy. If you're interested in a quick discovery call around AI that's complimentary, you can scan this code. And if you're interested in the full blown AI privacy workshop, then also you can scan a code. But for now, I think that's good enough. And let's move on, Saurabh. And we move on with challenges with AI systems. So when you are doing or creating AI systems, I think AI systems for me are similar to any other IT systems you are doing. And you had some challenges existing, like, for example, ethics was always a challenge, privacy was always a challenge, data residency, risk identification, compliance, and finding the right skills or having a return on investment has always been a challenge for IT. If you look at last 30, 40 years, these are the topics we've always been talking. Of course, privacy, ethics, and data residency are some of the new topics in last 5 years or 7 years. But these challenges, these questions, you are aware of it. You have to handle them, whether it's AI system or non-AI system, they have been in existence. But with the introduction of AI, what we call artificial intelligence, that is when systems start to learn and grow by themselves, you encounter new challenges like bias, because if the data is biased, data quality is not good, it introduces bias. We have the famous example of the Amazon using AI to recruit, and then it was filtering out female candidates because there were not enough female candidates in the data. So it thought in the actual selection of candidates, that is selection of CVs, it should do the same thing. And when it happens, it leads to hallucination. That is, AI starts to think of the world in its own way, and then it leads to toxic outcomes, toxic data, or toxic decisions. And that's where we are starting to talk about reliability of data as we talk about AI. That is, your data needs to be reliable and of very high quality. Plus, you need to introduce explainability into your AI system. That is, you can explain, or the AI system can explain to a human what it does, why it does, and how does it do it. And it's also creating a fear in the workforce, that is, they start to think, if a company says I'm going to invest in AI, like companies are usually saying we are going to put this much amount of money into AI, and immediately the fear is, oh, we are going to lose jobs. Well, that is then another challenge which comes with implementation of AI systems. But then there are some danger signs, or which are, I would say, big challenges which are coming up. All this, so the ethics, privacy, bias, hallucination, and workforce impact, what does it lead to? It leads to trust. Can I trust this system? Is this trustworthy? Will it take away my personal data? What will happen if I do this? What will happen if I do that? And that creates a bigger challenge. And then when we talk about AI, there's also shadow AI. Shadow AI mean we are always talking about AI system should do this, that, and all the requirements which we will talk. But who knows? There's a developer who's putting in some artificial intelligence type of logic in their system, and that's going under the radar, and nobody knows about, nobody talks about, nobody is doing the risk assessment on it, and it is not even in the list of systems of AI that is happening. So that's another risk we are running. And the biggest challenge we have with AI systems is they are very high expectations, and we tend to have over expectations rather than realistic expectations. So when we look at AI systems, these are some of the challenges we are seeing. And maybe Saurabh, you want to chime in and add what you want to, what do you see with your customers as well, because this is what we are seeing with our customers. Perhaps reasonably comprehensive risk but list, but what is your view?
Definitely, Puneet. It's early days of AI, right? It's like every new technology that has come. It was the same with the dot com boom. It was the same before that with everything else. I wasn't born, but I'm thinking it's probably the same when the first commercial flight took off and people were worried about it. It was probably the same when electricity distribution started happening and electricity came as a substitute for candles and whatever else we had. Inherently, the technology is going to go through its own growing up period. And for all of us as a species, this is a completely different level of disruption and innovation that's coming our way. And organizations, as they look at it, have to really figure out all of these challenges. A lot of customers we talk to have challenges in varying areas. And as we get into a little bit of this conversation, we'll dive into specifically for Salesforce how you can address some of these challenges, how you can mitigate it with your internal stakeholders, your legal compliance folks like that, and also how you can really do this well, how you can be fair to your customers who are trusting you with their data, and how you can make sure your brand, your services are aligned with some of these systems, with what's the right thing to do, and of course, with regulation and compliance requirements. So, with that, Puneet, I'm going to turn it over to you on the next slide again.
I think you said it very well. AI is early days, and whenever a new technology has come in, there has always been some chaos. But this is something at a different level that we are talking about. And the question then is, how do you manage this something else, or which is at a some other level? Well, when we look at the EU, that's the European Union, the approach has always been to focus on regulation. Few years ago, you saw the regulation on privacy, that is the EU GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which was helping individuals protect their rights, protect their privacy through various levels of impact assessments, various levels of records of processing activities, data residency requirement, data transfer requirements, and so on. So that was the way privacy was being managed in EU. Now, a lot of us said it'll kill innovation. A lot of us said it's excessive. But then 5 years later or 6 years later, if you look back, a lot of other countries, at least 100 plus other laws have been passed which are similar to GDPR. So that means what started as something in the EU has been replicated across regions. I mean, so much so, US does not have a federal level law except for HIPAA. If you look at it as a privacy law, there are laws at state level. And this is how the world is changing in terms of privacy. So much so, last year or earlier in this year, India passed its data protection bill. So that was on privacy. But if you look on AI, that the same thing is happening now. What EU is saying is let's have an EU AI Act, Artificial Intelligence Act, which defines what is an artificial intelligence system, proposes a risk based regulatory framework on how to manage that. I'll come to the risk regulatory framework in a moment. Imposes transparency obligations and demands organizations to be accountable and govern AI related systems. That's what is happening at the regulatory level. And my observation or forecast is that 5 years down the line, many countries, many states would also have a law similar to this or a regulation similar to this. So this is not something one off. This is not something that is happening in EU. It'll happen everywhere. If you notice, already in the market or around EU, US has its own AI framework. NIST has come up with AI framework or guidelines. There is Singapore coming up with the AI framework. China has its own AI framework. India has its own AI framework. OECD has its own framework. The UN published governing AI for humanity. So essentially, we are going to see a AI regulation phase in next few years, and EU is leading that. And in this session, we will be talking about what does this EU AI Act call for. Is this as scary as people what they are thinking, or is it something which is less scary? And in this context, Saurabh and me will focus on two dimensions: the policy and the process aspect. That is, how do you translate regulation or principles or framework into an internal policy and process? That's what will be my focus. And then, how do you translate that policy, process, and regulation into technology, that is, Salesforce or any other artificial intelligence usage on the ground? That's what Saurabh will be talking about. Maybe Saurabh, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think Puneet, you captured it well. And for everyone on the call, I've spent all my life in implementations, and that is one of the things that I've always found. You can attend a lot of webinars, you can read a lot of white papers, but a practitioner's perspective is what I've always found hard to get. And hopefully, this helps you. Puneet brings a lot of expertise of real world translation of regulatory and all of these legal sort of things into workable policies, into things that we can implement from a policy and process standpoint. And every large organization has to really think about it as we continue to pour money into data harmonization layers and AIs and co-pilots and all of that. And the other aspect of that is, how do you find viable ways of doing it, and what hooks do these technologies, do these LLMs offer? What capabilities can you think about and consider as you embark on your AI initiatives, particularly with reference to Salesforce? So that's going to be our focus as we move into this. So here is a classic example of some of the use cases that you may have heard about, you may be thinking about, you may be doing, right? Your support wants chatbots for service and support questions. Your sales leaders want to see an AI generated account 360 for pipeline review. You have customers and prospects who want to opt out of AI processing. And if you're a global organization, your users in other countries want it, which may have other kind of considerations around deploying these kind of things, even if you have a unified, Salesforce instance. So those are some of those classic use cases that I hear from customers all the time. And the gray area here is, which of them entail what kind of risks? How do we think about it, not only just from a technology perspective of delivering on these capabilities, but also from a risk compliance governance perspective, both in terms of GDPR and other current privacy laws, but also these sort of emerging AI Act and the AI related policies here in the United States and rest of the world. Puneet, you want to add something before I move on?
I think just one thing. These are the four broad use cases which we are going to use to emphasize the message on how do you handle this kind of situations. But if you have some specific use case or an expectation in mind, people can put it in the chat and we will be more than open to fit it into the conversation that we are going to have. So if you have very specific use case you are looking for as a solution or to solve it in terms of AI risk identification, does EU AI Act apply on it? Does GDPR apply on it? How can Salesforce help? How can maybe you can get privacy compliance on the Salesforce data that you have? If you have any question or any specific use case in mind, do not hesitate to put it in the chat and we will be very open to consider it. in the conversation.
Absolutely. All right. Go ahead, please.
So, as I was saying, that the European EU AI Act, which is the new act, which is almost in finalization state, but not finalized as we call it, but very much close to final, it is taking a risk based approach. So, when there's so much of fear around, guys, yeah, okay, anyways, all the slide is there so you can see. So, it's taking a risk based approach. That is, when you have a system, you identify what is the level of risk it's going to create. So if it's going to create a low or minimal risk, for example, you're going to run some targeting ads on your e-commerce platform, well, it's either going to create a low risk or a limited risk. So if that is the case, in case of low risk or minimal risk, there are no obligations. Second thing is, if it's a limited risk, there are only transparency obligations which have also existed in GDPR. That is, you are transparently informing this user on what is the risk, what are you going to do, and what is happening with their data. Now, here in EU AI Act, when we are talking about all data, not personal data, as in the case of EU GDPR. But if your system is going to create a high risk, for example, you're going to do biometric scanning on an airport. That's a high risk activity. That will be regulated, and that's where the EU AI Act would apply. And then there are some systems which are forbidden. So, like systems, AI systems in the war, AI systems which are going to impact vulnerable people. So, those risks are being classified as unacceptable risks, and that kind of AI is being prohibited. So, long story short, AI Act applies to all systems, but the obligations or requirements in there are not going to apply unless you are in the category of high risk systems. If you are in the low risk category or in the limited risk category, which typically are Salesforce AI apps or systems, or even 80% of your IT systems would fall in the limited or low risk. So either you have no obligation or you have a transparency obligation. So the simple obligation is perform a risk assessment, find out which risk category you are in, and at best do a transparency obligation, that is tell the people what you collect, why you collect, what you do with it, and what's the consequence for them, and an opportunity to intervene if needed. Where the all the requirements, which I will come to in coming slides, are going to be applied is in the high risk systems. So, in short, if you have to interpret, it's a risk based approach. Risk based approach meaning you perform a risk analysis if the risk is low or medium, very limited or no obligations, and in very few cases, all the requirements of EUAI Act.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add here is, the trick for a lot of these things, particularly for people who are on the delivery side of this, if you are responsible for driving the AI related initiatives in your organization, or if you're a stakeholder to them, the gray area is whatever I'm going to do, how do I know where does it fit on, this triangle? Which risk categorization is it in? Is it typical 80%, 20%? And I think that's where you kind of look at seasoned professionals like, Puneet here. And that's the part where I'm blissfully unaware. But I think that the key point here for people in on my side of the fence is to have an understanding of what kind of requirements will emanate from it, right? What kind of things do we need to think about as we build systems, as we design features, and how do we then enforce them? How can we bring those kind of requirements and deliver on them, materialize them? And that's kind of what we'll look into a little bit now. Go ahead, Preet.
So, now the question is, in case you are in the high risk category, what are the requirements that are going to come or going to be applied on your system? First and foremost is risk management. That is, you identify and manage all risks. And of course, if you classify your risk, your system in the category high risk, then the rest of the requirements also start to flow in. Now, data governance is another requirement, that all the data that your AI system is going to use is going to be managed, it's going to be governed, and it's going to be complemented with technical documentation on what the system does, why it does, how does it do, so that in case something goes wrong, people have a fallback and people can understand what is being done. Now, risk management, data governance, or technical documentation, you've been doing it for all your systems. So I don't think that's new. What starts to be a bit new is the record keeping. Now, in the EU GDPR, record keeping was always there in terms of the records of processing activity. But here you have to do record keeping also in terms of maintaining a list of systems, keeping a log of what risks they create, and so on and so forth. And another one is transparency, that is giving notice and explaining it to individuals what is being done by AI system. That's going to be a bit hard because it's a new area. In GDPR, transparency in terms of privacy notice and cookie notice was easier because you only need to do it on personal data, and here you have to do it on all, and it's not on the data being processed, it's also on what is the processing doing and what are the risks that are being created. But that we will learn as we go along. And another important requirement is human oversight. So you don't want the mission impossible kind of scenario that AI has gone wild and nobody's in control. That's why they're recommending that there's always a possibility for human intervention or human oversight in whatever the AI system will do. And I think that's a good thing to do. Now, we talked about hallucination, bias, and toxicity, and that's where we would say accuracy and robustness of the data is also important. And if it is not, you need to find out, maybe adding noise to the data and making it more accurate, or creating some synthetic data. Those are the things you will need to look at. Now, cybersecurity is not new. Maybe somebody went too fast. Cybersecurity is not new. Cybersecurity has also been there. And another introduction is quality management system, that is for all high risk systems. You put in quality measures and measure and demonstrate that those are being done on a regular basis. And in the EU, if you're intending to publish a high risk AI system, you need to inform authorities. You need to get registered with them. They will give you a CE marking, and that you can use to demonstrate compliance with the AU AI Act. So if you scan these requirements, some things you have been doing, some things are new, and then there's the obligation of doing them and demonstrating your accountability in doing all these things. But remember, not for all the systems, only for high risk systems, that you have to comply with all these requirements. Now, what happens is this gets into a complex domain. There are so many requirements already. If you look at 12 on the screen, then the GDPR has requirements and so on and so forth. So, how do you do it? If you practically look at taking these requirements and applying it to scenario, I think the simple case is take your use case, run via each and every block of requirement, and see which one applies and what you need to do. Of course, from EUA Act perspective, not many will apply if your system is not an high risk system. But from GDPR perspective, if you look at the GDPR requirements, we do have a similar sheet on GDPR, then everything applies. And that's what me and Saurabh are going to demonstrate in the next slide, when we take the four use cases and showcase to you some of the considerations from AI and privacy perspective that can come in. Now, what we're going to use demonstrate is a very simplified version of it, because in the real life you'll take all the requirements, make an Excel sheet, and try to match against that use case which one apply. For example, in GDPR terms, you do a data protection impact assessment, and in the AI terms or EUA Act terms, you'll do a full blown risk assessment. And in that risk assessment, you will identify the risk, assess the risk, and then match based on the risk which requirements would apply. Here, we will showcase to you a very simplified version of it. Maybe we can move to the next part. Yeah. So if we look at the four use cases and simply say there's a four requirements. One is the regional privacy law compliance with GDPR, CCPA, or DPDP, based on which region you are in. Maybe there is ethical consideration around bias, toxicity, and hallucination, or all those concerns. And then there is also the data security, cyber security, or access to sensitive data, or selective access to some AI prompts, and even protecting customer data. And then there's the requirement of data residency or sovereignty of data. So how do you match this? Do you do one-on-one mapping? Do you do one use case on each of the requirements? And as you'll see, even in a simplified version, there's a crisscross. That's a mapping of one going to two or two going to one. That's what is happening. And that's what is a learning or is a message you can take, that when you're applying AI Act or GDPR or any other privacy law or AI law, you need to do this kind of mapping. If sort of you want to add something.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a technology person in the room here, in the virtual room here, that is the challenge we are set up against, right? Here is a set of requirements that have come from our partners in legal, compliance, regulatory, privacy, or some external groups, some consulting company we are working with. And they're like, here it is, here are some policies, here are some requirements and some of the things that your business wants to do, some of the AI initiatives you have, some of these regulations apply to it. And now comes the big challenge of, all right, how do I translate it over? How do I actually do these things inside Salesforce so that I can deliver on these in a timely manner? And we've had an opportunity to, in the last 15 months or so, to actually look at them much more closely, primarily because we are working in this space. So, with that in mind, if I look at how they come together, we are going to do a translation of all things Salesforce from a policy and process perspective. I'm going to turn this over to Puneet to talk for a minute or so on policy and process, and then we take all of this and get into specifics from a Salesforce perspective. Go ahead, Puneet.
Sure. So typically, the life cycle of implementation of an AI or a privacy law is that you will have your legal counsel or a AI specialist or privacy specialist coming up with a policy or the regulation. So they will take the regulation and translate into policy. Now, you as an IT person or a technologist would say, now what do I have to do? I think what this framework articulates is how do you translate your regulation, which has been translated into a policy, into an actionable set of things to do. While your IT life cycle, the software development life cycle, whether it's agile or waterfall, will continue, but from a compliance with AI Act or GDPR, you would create a register. So I'm starting with the block on the right side of policy. So based on the policy, you'll create a register of saying which are the systems that classify or that would get into the scope of this policy. You will make a note of the risk, that is you'll start to manage the risk, since as soon as the system is registered in that list, you need to manage risk. At register level, you'll keep in which category of risk it is: high risk, medium risk, low risk, as we were talking in the triangle. And at detailed level in management of risk, you will manage all the risks that are identified. You'll also make a list of or approach your CISO office and say what are the security measures and privacy measures we have to put in place. So basically, you go to security and privacy colleagues. From a transparency perspective, once you have managed the risk, you identified the security measures, you go into explaining all those things and having the documentation around what have you done, what risks you identified, what actions you took, and you capture all that in the documentation format. Two sets of documentation: technical documentation for your internal housekeeping or record keeping, and the notices or product specs or guidance, or sometimes we call it end user licensing agreements for the users, so that they can also be confident that this is the right product, and also for the regulators so that they can be confident that your product is conformant. So when you submit all that to the conformity authority, register your system, you get a conformity certificate. And now all this requires a lot of governance in a large organization. And that's why we put governance on top. So while you do all this, you need to make sure that there is governance all around. So if you talk about taking a regulation, incorporating it into your environment, and having it working well as a process while there's a policy, I think this is the framework we recommend for companies to take in and start their journey on compliance. Now, when you have done this, then you get into the technology side of it. But for you to be responsible on AI and privacy side of it, and as EU calls it, responsible AI that is good for humanity or society, and also helping us in the sustainability of it, you have to do these things. And when you do these things, then your technology team has a fundamental basis, your data team has a fundamental basis to take care of their regular processes on data lifecycle management, software development lifecycle management, and so on and so forth. So let's move on to that side of the story now.
All right. So let's talk for a minute about the Salesforce part of the world. We got these policies, we've got some of these processes in place, we've got these requirements. So what can you do with AI today inside Salesforce? And I think a lot of people are probably aware of it. And then how did we look at them, as we were tasked with looking at these kind of things? So, a little bit of explanation of what we built and how some of these are things that we added. And really, the idea here is that you can draw a parallel and see how they apply to your initiatives as you are embarking on Salesforce and AI and doing all of that. So, at a very simple level, the idea is you've got grunt work, all of this manual stuff that's happening, whether you're summarizing opportunities, summarizing case comments, doing root cause analysis, figuring out intent, doing account 360, generating emails, all of that, right? You've got grunt work, you can automate it with AI, uh, and then you can get some of those features on the right hand side here. We built this thing called GPT-5. It's an app exchange app that lets you bring your own AI model. And so we had to deal with all of these things that Puneet was talking about earlier. And the idea was, how do we enable AI for business? How do we make it easy for your business to use and create and deploy prompts without everybody in the world learning prompt engineering? And how do you focus on usability and adoption? And how do you enforce all of these security, privacy policies, all of this stuff that's coming our way? And how do you easily enable AI across the enterprise using Salesforce as the vehicle for distributing it and bringing in a lot of digital transformation, which is AI driven? So let's take those requirements that Puneet mentioned about earlier. Let's think in terms of a solution that's natively inside Salesforce and see how you would meet them. So that's the first category here, which is bias and toxicity, as Puneet was talking about. LLMs are fed data from the internet in a lot of other places, data that is generated, but it probably looked at internet for its artificial generation. So a lot of our inherent biases that exist in the real world have been communicated to these technologies, and they have a potential of showing up. There are a couple of things that you can do, some which are technology related, some which are process related, and some which are just considerations as you embark on your missions. Number one is you want to avoid fully automated AI use cases wherever you can. A very classic example is someone sends an email, you can completely auto generate a response and send it back. Do you want to do that? Very few areas where you should. Most of the areas you probably don't. You want someone who's looking at them. So instead of going from manual to 100% automated, you may go manual to semi automated to something else. The second part of this around toxicity and bias is you can apply regular data audits. And I'll show you an example of some of these in just another minute. You can apply regular data audits. You can also collect user feedback for reinforcement learning, known as RLHF in the technology world. So you can apply things like these. So when you think about it from a Salesforce standpoint, here is an example of how we are doing these, right? We look at a response, we take out information, we also audit everything that's going out and in so that you have an ability to run quality assurance on it. And as you can see, this data is tagged, right? I know what is an email number, what is all these other things. And so, if you have internal quality assurance folks, if you have legal, if you have audit, if you have compliance, if you have folks who need to know what was sent, what got back, is the AI doing what we asked it to do? We log everything so that you are able to kind of identify and ensure that it is in line with the expectation and the requirements that your organization has. Here is another example, which is around collecting user feedback on the response. So, what you see here in the screenshot is the sort of account 360, or in this case, a dealer 360 for automobile dealers. And then the user can actually look at a response and do a thumbs up, thumbs down, and they can actually provide additional feedback on what was the issue. Was it partial, or was it made up? And the advantage of this approach, particularly for large enterprises and organizations that have a diverse set of users all over the world, the advantage of this approach is it lets your users have a voice directly into what's getting created. And your people who are looking at prompt designing, who are looking at deployment of the system, at user adoption, regulatory compliance type challenges, they can now think about this and make sure that if their prompts are not working correctly, if there are challenges in the space, then those are logged. They're able to tweak the prompt, they're able to turn the other knobs that they can on the AI side and address these sort of specific requirements and risks. Um, Another example of this is hallucinations, which again Puneet mentioned earlier, right? How bias, toxicity, and hallucinations are significant challenges, and you have certain levers here that you can tweak, particularly if you are in a bring your own model kind of environment. So let's say it's your AI integrated into Salesforce through a solution like GPT-5. So you can tweak the temperature of AI, and temperature is a setting which actually tells AI how imaginative it needs to be. So if you are writing stories for children's book, you probably want your AI to be very imaginative. But on the business side, if you're summarizing information, if you're doing other things, you may want to tweak your AI so that it is more realistic from a temperature standpoint. And the thing that we found is there are a lot of different scenarios, and you may need different temperatures. And so we ended up building hooks that allow you to have different temperature on your AI model, driven by what prompt you're using, and you also set a default temperature at a model level. So there are things like that that you can do. The other part of this is how do you ensure that AI actually understands what you're asking? This is particularly important in diverse geographies like the European Union, different languages, different notions, different meaning of what was said. And so you want your AI to have a really good understanding of what is the user asking. And we also want to have guardrails so your AI doesn't go haywire in its responses to it. So an example of both of these is here is a screenshot of temperature. You can change it at the connection level here. You can also specify temperature at a prompt level with GPT-5. The other thing is on the grounding. We've built support for grounding and we're adding more of it so that when you're writing prompts and releasing it to your end users, you can build in enough grounding so that it understands what it is not expected to do. You can ask it to not exaggerate. You do not want it to hallucinate or use emotive language or provocative things. So you can add a lot of those kind of things, and all these LLMs, all of these AI models are significantly getting better and better with every subsequent release. This is definitely a problem for this industry, and a lot of organizations are, trying to solve it really, really well. So that is kind of one part of it. Is before we move into the others, Puneet, anything you would like to add here?
No, I'm good, but I think what I would like to emphasize is when we say it in a webinar, it's much more simpler and it sounds like okay, you have a regulation, convert it to a policy, put some governance, put some implementation, and it goes. It takes a huge amount of thinking and strategizing on how do you want AI to work for you. And then these steps come in. So don't underestimate the amount of effort that goes behind in doing all this.
Very well said. I'm so glad you mentioned this because I completely agree. It's one of my pet peeves is that you go to these webinars and you listen to these vendors, and it just seems like everything is so easy. You just buy their product, buy their service, buy their whatever they're selling, and voila, everything gets solved. And this is definitely a challenge. People who've been in the delivery business long enough understand that it's a lot easier to say it in a webinar versus to actually translate it on the ground and deliver on a feature. And I think one of the things again I'll mention here is what Punita is talking about. That's the kind of thinking that I find sometimes is missing with organizations, because people who are on the policy making side of it and we're looking at requirements often don't relate very well to the challenges of actually building and deploying. At least that's been my experience in certain areas, because your delivery and enforcement from a technology standpoint is somewhat disconnected from here is a set of requirements, here's a set of policy. And I think it's that bridge, that gulf that we have to cross, and that's the challenge that we are up against when we look at these from a concept to a delivery. So well said, Puneet. So
And
on
one
that
of the things
front,
you can take from this webinar is that you may be a technologist, you may be a compliance person, you may be a risk person or an audit person or a technology person, whatever you are. I think you need to collaborate with all other teams and ask them to engage or involve you from the start. Don't go into a mode that, okay, we are writing policy, we will come back to you. And you go, we are developing the system, we will come back to you. That's not an approach that will work. You have to consistently engage and dialogue and keep working with each other. And that's what governance is all about.
Perfect. Well put. All right. So let's talk about the other part of this that, as you're looking at deploying something like this, maybe you're a large European organization or someone based in America or somewhere else in the world, and you want to now deploy it to Australia, to China, to, other parts of the world. And some of those regions have their own regulations, particularly around data residency. So if I'm deploying an AI technology, some of these regions may mandate that the AI processing needs to happen on their geography, on their land. And this is one of the examples where we had to build in specifically features that would allow our customers to do that. So your AI inside, you can have multiple AI connections inside your Salesforce and associate it all the way to a prompt level, and that way you can ensure that if a processing needs to happen, in certain geographies, that can happen. But even beyond that, one of the classic use case that comes in is, uh, I want my sales users in America to be able to use AI, but I don't want to use it for EU. Let's just say, just because it's, we are still kind of waiting for clarification from our EU counterparts. That's an example of that. How do I limit it to a specific set of user inside Salesforce? An even more complex version of this is the opt-in, right? If you have customers, if you have leads, if you have prospects who are saying, opt me out, do not apply AI on my data. How do you do that in a system like Salesforce, where the whole idea is to bring in information on leads, prospects, all of those? And how do you then ensure that you are processing their data or applying AI based on their opt-ins or opt-outs, so that you can do it where you have a legitimate basis to do it, where you have a consent, and areas where you don't. So these are some of the things that we looked at, and so we ended up designing this so that on a prompt level you can actually assign a prompt to a specific profile. So it could be that I may have a profile for my sales user in the US and a sales user in EU. You can also apply it on a user level. So if I wanted to give the capability to run, GPT-5 to specific named users, you can do that. Through permission sets, through feature licenses, we have things like that baked into the product, so that you can give it to a small pilot group in a particular geography, for a particular brand, for a particular business unit, and expand from there. In addition, if you have different record types, right, I may have a prospect record type for United States, for Europe, for China, whatever it is, and I can apply it at that level. So there is a lot of granularity that we had to build in specifically to address things like this. Another version of this is on the opt-in opt-out part of this. So based on the specific attributes of a record, you can configure so that you either show prompts or you do not show prompts. So your prompt, at a prompt level, you can say, hey, this is a prompt that is going against case. For example, maybe I'm doing case summarization, and I'm going to say, summarize cases if the related contact opted in for AI processing, right? So that's an example. If it's auto generated email, only send auto generated emails if somebody opted in for that. And you can again kind of go back and forth with your legal compliance folks like that to figure out which of them are viable areas where you have to do it, because back to the triangle that Puneet was showing, some things you may not need to do any of this, but there are others where these may become fairly important. So this is another sort of example of how you can apply some of these. Puneet, any comments?
No, I'm good with that. What you said is perfectly fine. And I think when we talk about privacy compliance, one of the issues that we not often talk about is consent. And managing consent is a huge challenge. And when you are in Salesforce, you need to capture consent from different geographies and from different perspectives, so regional perspectives. And that's one thing we can do much more effectively because of the way the structure is or the architecture is.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a whole another topic for another day, but 100% agreed. It's a very tricky area uh, everywhere else, and including in Salesforce. Um, So, with that, let's talk about the data residency part, which I briefly mentioned earlier. So, we actually built this whole framework where you can have multiple connection. So, if you're using OpenAI on Azure, and you may say, "Well, I want, for my users in China, I wanted to go to the China instance of OpenAI running on Azure." And for users in Europe, I want to, send them to my OpenAI on Azure instance that's running in a data center in Germany, and so on and so forth. So you have the ability to actually do that with GPT-5. So you can actually configure this, and it's just a simple configuration. And then you can send every prompt and the response of it to specific, AI model connection, and ensure that you are able to do that sort of data residency when you're looking at, complying with these kind of requirements. So it's another one of those areas which is really interesting, because now you're trying to address these kind of requirements, and you may start with one geography. You may go, I'm going to do this in Europe, and then eventually I'll do it in other areas, and then just sort of grow it from there. So that's an example of how we ended up building it. My next portion of this is on data security and trust. Puneet, any quick comment on the data residency before we move forward?
I think data residency is often misunderstood. No one in the EU or most laws is saying data should stay in that country. But what it is saying is data should stay in countries that often or that offer sufficient safeguards. So where there is adequacy, and that's where the data needs to stay. So don't interpret data residency as something saying do not move my data. You can move data, you can transfer data, but with safeguards and with conditions.
Well said. Absolutely. And that's why you need someone like a Puneet to actually dive further, into the nuances of this. All right. So let's talk about another area which is a huge one and comes up pretty much on 80% of the calls I have with the customers and prospects, any Salesforce customer, and that's around data security and trust. One of the challenges, how do you do this in a secure manner? So here is a typical flow, and we've built this in GPT-5. I know Salesforce does that with Trust Layer, sort of very similar ideas, right? You're securely extracting information out of your system. Let's say you are doing a summarization of opportunities for pipeline review, so that your reps can have a sales pipeline conversation with their sales leadership. So I'm pulling a bunch of information, and what I need to do is mask it. So I want to mask out names, I want to mask out email address, IP address, phone numbers, any kind of things. I may have driver's license, passport numbers. Maybe I'm in hospitality, I'm travel. Maybe I'm in med tech, and I sell to very large enterprises. I sell to the military. So a lot of those kind of different things, and I need to mask this information before it travels further. Then I send it to some sort of AI, right? It could be OpenAI, it could be Amazon Bedrock. You may be running Anthropic or Claude on AWS. You may be doing Google Cloud Vertex or Gemini now. So you're doing some of that stuff. But when you send data to it, we would retain all of the PII natively inside Salesforce, mask it, and instead of an identifier like my name, Saurabh, I may send person one. And I'll show you an example of this in a minute. So once you send it, AI does its thing, brings it back, and you can then, kind of reintroduce the PII back into it so as to make the response relevant to your end user, and then you can present it. You can also automate it with GPT-5. We do automate it, so you can then update fields on records and do other things with them, send emails, create tasks, activities, whatever you need to do there. So the idea is all through this cycle, you're able to meet requirements by keeping your data on trusted platform like Salesforce, and then also on the AI side, you can tweak settings. So I think on OpenAI, you have settings, particularly with Azure, where you can just turn off retention. So it will not retain your information after it's done processing. So while it's there, it processes, it keeps it. Once it's done, it sends it back. It doesn't exist on their side. So by using a combination of these approaches, you can go a long way in meeting these requirements. And that's what we are seeing, particularly in regulated sector, financial services, insurance, healthcare, med tech companies, a lot of automobile manufacturers. They're quite concerned about some of these, and we can help them meet this. So an example of how you would do this is here, right? So is when you configure what you call a data context mapping in GPT-5, which is completely declarative. You actually tell us. So you tell us that, hey, we need to mask, attributes such as first name, last name, those kind of things. You can also tell us to mask based on patterns, so like an email address pattern, a social security number pattern, a taxpayer identification, passport number, driver's license, phone numbers. So you can tell us different kind of patterns, which is regex in in the tech world. So based on regex or patterns, based on specific values in fields, and we also support a block list, so you can put values that you want to be sanitized and moved out, masked before data gets sent. So you can do all of that. In this example here, what you're seeing is this is what was pulled initially and inside Salesforce, but before it was sent to AI, the phone numbers were masked, right? The names were masked. So what you're looking at here is information that was masked. Some information wasn't masked because it wasn't deemed sensitive. So it's a great example of how you can ensure that you're able to meet requirements, and you can also demonstrate how you're meeting them. So for every prompt execution that happens in GPT-5 on your Salesforce, we create this record so that you have a full auditability and transparency in proving that this is how you're meeting these requirements. Puneet, anything you want to add to this?
No, not on this one. Thank you.
So, in summary, when you think about this, it really boils down into these two areas. I'm going to let Puneet talk about policy and process, and then I can, give a little bit on the tech. Puneet, go ahead.
I think there are three parts to the conversation when we are talking about AI or privacy implementations or complying with the law. First is the policy and process aspect of it. That is, you set up a good policy and establish a good governance, risk management practices, security practices, and so on. So that's at a process level what I do or my team does. And then the second dimension, which Saurabh will explain you, is the Salesforce or AI aspect of it. And then there is a third dimension of keeping this process and technology aspect sustainable and keep on doing it in the right way. So, from my perspective, I think if you start by having a good, strong policy, process, and principles and interpret from the law and make it sustainable, that is the best way to start. And at that time, you need to think of where your company is operating and where it will be operating in 5 years' time, so that you don't have to change these policies and processes every time your company is starting a new business.
That's well put, Puneet. And yeah, on the tech side, when you think of Salesforce and AI, the good news is I've always loved the fact that Salesforce as a platform offers you a ton of hooks. The ability to extend and actually do these kind of things becomes dramatically easier because you have flows, validation rules, a whole set of things that you can apply. So all the validation, all the automation you can do. And we've kind of really built a whole product on those capabilities, right? So that you can natively mask information, you can natively do all of that other stuff around who gets to even use AI, what records can they use it on, all of that. And as we continue to do more innovation in it, the idea is that as customers, as implementers of these technologies, you have choices, right? You can look at how do I do these things? How do I meet these requirements? You can do that with Salesforce's AI Cloud. You can do that with GPT-5, and you can kind of go ahead and build your own if you so desire. The good news is you have the opportunity to do it in at least a couple of different ways. And the better news here is there is a lot happening in the tech space to make some of these things easy. The bad news in all of this is there is work to be done here, and a lot of organizations need to think deeply about how do they do the foundational policy process work that Puneet was talking about, and how do they really think about the end user, about our customers, our stakeholders, our partners. How do we think fairly and in the best interest of all of them? Because all of us have the same sort of thing when we go out in the world and buy things. We are customers to somebody, we are prospects to somebody, we are partners to somebody, employees to someone. And when you think of that perspective, there is a humanity angle that we have to apply, you know, and that is what all these rules, regulation, and policies are about. So how do we apply it in that top, layer up there of policy and process? And then how do we realistically do that in technology so that we can deliver it without spending millions of dollars or euros, without spending months, years, year and a half, 2 years, just trying to get these things off the ground. One of the biggest challenge I find with all the customers that I speak with all the time is that a lot of this gets mired in either the marketing savviness of like, oh, you can just buy this today and it will do everything for you. No, it won't. None of these technologies would, from any vendor in the world, right? There is always the aspect of a business figuring out what is in the best interest of their customers, of their stakeholders, and of their business. So you can definitely give it a try. By the way, GPT-5 is available on App Exchange, and it is available in a free edition. You can definitely install it in a sandbox. You can give us a call. We can, schedule a meeting with us through gpt5.ai. We can help you get up and running. Great way to try it, pilot it out, and see if this really helps your organization, and also address some of your own internal use cases. And that's kind of the approach that I think I and Puneet like a lot. So that's what we are doing on the GPT-5 front. You can actually join this group, and one of my colleagues would probably share this link in a minute. And this is a LinkedIn group where we share a lot of like these recordings, PDFs. You can interact with me or Puneet. This is kind of a vehicle that we're using to make sure that people are able to utilize this group, and you can leverage a lot of value out of it.
Maybe
Finally,
sort of what we can do is there are a couple of questions, so let's a little bit give people quick answers. So one of the questions is around if the email is AI generated and there's generalized generated data based on the lead providing that data, how can we validate in terms of bias or other challenges? So, well, these are not easy questions. The only way is to continue to check on the quality of data and put some human supervision on it, put some thinking on it, that if that data generation, of course email generation is a very simple example and there the risk of bias is less, but the only way is human intervention. Then there's a question of how is masking different from data tagging? Well, data tagging is different. You have sets of data, you mask it, tag it as personal, sensitive, health, and so on. While in masking, we are talking about, let's say, there's data about me and Saurabh, and you mask my name, Saurabh's name, age, and date of birth, or maybe replace it with a fictitious date or similar date, but then it's not personal data, and you can give it to AI system for what do we say, analysis. And there's also a question, but if you want to discuss these topics in detail, maybe you can contact Saurabh or me. And also, if you are interested in the AI workshop or discovery call in terms of ascertaining which risk category your system is in, you can talk to us. And one of the other questions is also about shadow IT, saying how it is a challenge for GPT systems if well governed and well enterprise solution is not available. Well, there's always a policy, there's always a governance, but then these things do exist. So that's the reality of world. The only solution in that case is awareness, awareness, and awareness. Keep talking to people and keep telling them, and that's where sessions like this help, workshops or discovery calls help, and demos help.
yeah, I also want to add a little bit more on that. I think one of the question that came in was, what is your view on the risk of using GPT-5 to summarize information I have about a company? I want to understand various data points, my interaction. So, like, basically, you want to do like an account 360, right? A very classic example that we were talking about earlier. But I'm still exposed to sending unstructured data with all kind of potentially confidential details. So we actually, in our masking, we actually do address that. Like, not only are we masking information here, which is kind of what we are showing in the screenshot, but we would act, our GPT-5 would actually look for this in all the unstructured data. So on your long text field, your rich text field, your email body, if you're logging emails, in your case comments, it would then look for all of these values and take them out of your unstructured data, because that, it's a very well put there. I mean, that is a challenge for anybody who's going out and trying to do this. Particularly your legal compliance and infosec will be like, wait a minute, what about unstructured data? Because with generative AI, the value of it is on unstructured data so much more than anything else. So I think that kind of a compliance risk you can address. Another, I wanted to add a little bit more on some of the other questions that Puneet also mentioned. So, Harika asked, do you offer customized solution depending on requirement? Yes, we do. Harika, we've spent 5 years in the GDPR space. We do right to be forgotten portability, data retention, all of that. And GPT-5 is not different. We actually, our DNA is data security and privacy, and we've just extended it into AI. So happy to have a conversation on it if we need to. Uh, I think Michelle asked a question on how is masking different from tagging field is sensitive. Puneet already talked a little bit from a technology side on that. Is like, you could tag a field as sensitive. Let's say you have email, right? Like an email body, right? You have an email that someone sent. You have email to case, email to lead. You got an email, right? And in the email, I said, oh, by the way, my phone number is blah. Reach out to me. Correct. And if I was tagging, I can tag that entire field and I can say this field is sensitive, it's PII, it's confidential, it's whatever, right? I'm doing that at a field level. In terms of masking, I'm masking specific values inside that field. So on that email body, I may just want to mask away that phone number and it would just say, please contact me on phone 40, right? Just how it says there, his phone number, it's replaced with phone 40. The idea is, AI still knows it's a phone number, it doesn't have the exact number. So that's kind of an example of how you can think of masking being different from tagging, at least from a technology standpoint, how I look at that. Um, the question on email is AI generated, I heard what Puneet said. My sort of very simplistic view on this is also like, if this was an email that you could have answered with an email template, like transactional emails, hi, your order is going to be delivered on this date, whatever, right? Those are great. You can obviously do 100% automation. You may already have done. I think outside of that, a lot of these email types things boil down into two areas. One is a confirmation, right? So I have a customer where they get orders on email, right? Like someone attaches a PDF and sends it to an email and they create a case out of it, right? And then somebody follows up. So now what we're doing is we can extract that information, we can update it on the case itself, right? And then I can actually just send back an automated email saying, hey, this is kind of what we get, and we just wanted you to, FYI, here is an example, here is what we have received, here is how we translated it, let us know if anything is different. For an example of that. The other is if you're going against your own knowledge base, right? So if you do what is known as RAG, retrieval augmented generation, and maybe you have AI that's looking at your PDFs, that's looking at your Salesforce knowledge or third party knowledge bases, and we do a bunch of those kind of things. And so now if someone sends an email and I'm looking at that knowledge base, I can pick up a link or a bunch of links and send it back. Where the potential for open to interpretation is relatively less, where I can lower the temperature down, those may be good use cases. But again, best practices, as Puneet said, you definitely want to do sampling of information. You want to have audit, like any other process where we apply QA. This is a sort of a QA sampling auditing to make sure that this is in line with the acceptable levels of hallucination, bias, toxicity, whatever it is, and your AI is not going astray. So sort of a long-winded answer. I hope this addresses it. I'm looking at this. I'm not seeing any other questions here. Steve asked about shadow IT. I see a challenge for GPT for well governed. True, I agree, Steve. I think if it is a foundational challenge on both sides, I think what Puneet mentioned with shadow IT was more on terms of IT that what Puneet mentioned with shadow AI was more in terms of AI that is hidden. You don't see it, right? Like I may be a third party vendor. I'm like, oh look, fill this form and we will send you this, and then I'm just kind of doing something that has a malified intention. There wasn't enough transparency into what I'm doing, and I am using AI in sort of those bad ways. The other term, particularly in our trade, that I've heard from people when they talk about shadow AI or shadow GPT, is literally you take data from Salesforce, you go into Chat GPT or some other AI, Gemini or whatever, Claude, and you paste it there, and you're like, give me a summary of this, right? And you're trying this out. So that is a huge challenge now. A significant portion of knowledge workers today are using an approved system, and it's getting harder and harder to control it just because of the sheer proliferation of these things through Chrome extensions, through having it on my own phone, and all those bring your own devices. So hopefully that addresses the question. Um, Let me see. Mary asked, for those in EU, PI is really important GDPR wise. Absolutely. No doubt about that, Mary. And again, that's kind of Puneet is based in Belgium, the heartland of GDPR. And I think that's one of the reason I wanted him to come is like, we want to hear straight from people who are, at the center of what's happening there. Michelle asked, how often must you revalidate bias to remain compliant? I always think of these things, Michelle, as it depends, right? On the nature of work, on the perception of risk from your organization. So the beauty of risk is that it boils down to every organization's own thinking about it. So should you do it every day, every week, every quarter, every month? Really depends on your what kind of things are you doing, what are you processing, and what is considered okay by your legal counsel and other stakeholders. Puneet, I know we are a bit over, but anything you want to add to this?
No, I think we are good. I shared my perspective on these things, and these are complex topics. There are no straightforward answers. It's context based and situation based. If you are doing some biometric analysis, and then bias and hallucination needs to be checked maybe every minute. But if it's simple generation of email for customers that your order is processed, then once a month is also good enough.
True. Well said. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, as I mentioned, if you're looking to do anything with Salesforce and AI, GPT-5 is available on App Exchange and it is available in a free edition. Please download it. You can literally try it out. The setup is fairly simple in like under 15-20 minutes. You can have this thing up and running. Again, if you need help, let us know. Please do connect with me and Puneet on LinkedIn. And I'm pretty active there. So happy to answer questions, collaborate there. Or you can also reach out to us through gpt5.ai. With that, and of course, as Puneet mentioned, you can take benefit of the complimentary AI workshop that he runs, and at least get a sense of all of these things from a regulatory and compliance perspective, from someone who knows about it a heck of a lot more than I do. Uh, so that's it. Thank you so much for taking the time today, and please do put in comments any other questions or feedbacks you have. Puneet,
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
yeah, take care. Bye bye.